we're picking up where we left off with chapter 20. We were talking about some new African kingdoms that benefited from the slave trade, that became powerful. The old African kingdoms fall away a little bit. And we again cleared up some of these misconceptions. Trade is actually controlled by the African rulers more often than not at first. How many of you actually ended up reading that article, that document from the African king, Nzinga Mbemba? Okay, you really need to read that. You need to read that. That will definitely reshape the way that you look at the slave trade. The Cliff Notes version of it is that once the slave trade with the Portuguese has been going for a while, the African monarch is powerless to stop it. He doesn't like the fact that the Portuguese are continuing to take slaves from his kingdom. And yes, they are kidnapping some of his people, but more importantly, he just doesn't like the slave trade anymore. Why do you think he would be unable to stop it? Eileen? Right. He's trying to keep up with other empires and their guns, and this is what we call the gun slave cycle. The Europeans are giving weapons to these African kingdoms. Those weapons make them more effective in these wars to gain captives. So more guns means they get to capture more slaves. Capturing more slaves means you get to sell more slaves in return for more guns. If you stop this cycle, what happens to you? You don't have as many guns as the kingdom next to you. And so now instead of you being the one to win the battle, you're the one that loses the battle because you've lost your technological advantage. And now you're the one in the picture getting enslaved. So this becomes a vicious cycle that many of the kingdoms are unable to break. And what they start to realize is once they're in it, they're stuck. And the slave trade must go on. So are we good with the gun slave cycle? This makes sense. You can see how this just builds and builds and builds and builds. Nod your heads. Okay. All right. What this leads to is something called the triangle trade. And this is a big SOL concept also. So this is something you need to know. The triangle trade is actual economic exchange. It's trade, it's bartering, it's give and take. The Europeans come down from Europe with their slave ships. And they get to this part of West Africa, which is called the Gold Coast. That's where Ashanti and Dahomey and Benin and Congo and a lot of those other slave kingdoms were. You exchange your manufactured goods for slaves. And again, if you're European, what are you giving in order to get slaves? Guns. And there's one other big trade product that you hand off to the African rulers. Goes great with guns. Rum. Alcohol and firearms.
Oh, joy. I must be fighting those now.
Yeah. Good combination. So, guns and rum go to Africa. Slaves come out of Africa across what we call the Middle Passage. It's the middle leg of this triangle. It's the middle path across the Atlantic Ocean from top to bottom, whatever way helps you remember it. And we're taking these slaves to the New World colonies run by the Spanish and Portuguese. And what are we going to have them do there? Work. Doing what? Sugar plantations. What else? Cotton. Tobacco. You remember Potosi? Mining. Gold and silver. The biggest employers of slaves will be mining and sugar. Now, I know here in Virginia, cotton and tobacco is very near and dear to our hearts because that was kind of our colonial heritage. But again, you have to remember, those were the less desirable crops. You were growing those because you were out of the range of sugar. The climate wasn't right. You couldn't grow the best crop, and you couldn't mine gold and silver, so you had to find something else. Tobacco and cotton were not as profitable as sugar and gold and silver. So there's another stereotype to break. We were not the center of the slave trade. We were peripheral. That's why there were so few slaves relatively that were brought to the North American colonies. Remember, it was 400,000 compared to 9 million, 10 million. It's a fraction. Now again, this is another cyclical cycle. Guns for slaves. What do slaves do to your crop output? Do you get more or less with large numbers of slaves working? You get more. So now you're shipping that back at a greater profit to Europe, which manufactures all these things, which allows them to sell them, which gives them more money to build more guns, to sell more guns for more slaves, which means more crops, which means this cycle, just like the gun-slave cycle, gets larger and larger and larger as time goes on. And this is starting in the 1500s, and this is running all the way through the 1700s. This is 200 years of continuous growth and exploitation. Questions about this? Nick?
When the slaves, leg of the triangle dried up because they stopped the slave trade to the Americas, did the rest of the triangle just disappear, or was there portions that survived?
That's a good question. If the slave trade would have stopped, or even when it did stop, what happens to the rest? You are still going to have this colonial exchange between the European colonies and Europe itself. You're going to preserve slavery in North America until the Civil War. And so cotton and tobacco will continue to be big exports back to Europe. European goods will be the bulk of the colonial economy, which is why things like the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act were such a big deal, because they were impacting colonial imports. Good question.
What about sending manufactured goods from Africa?
At that point, they're just going to stop trading. Ackerman. Yeah, sure. You bet. They need you up in the office. They need you up in the office. Yeah. All right. Well, what's going to happen eventually with Europe and Africa is that rather than just engaging in the slave trade, once Europe's technology improves, they will actually go and just colonize Africa. And that's when you're going to see the tables turn and Europe become the dominant power there. All right. Just again, to reinforce this idea that sugar was the dominant one, this is a product breakdown of the Caribbean. All the places where you see S, it's sugar. So just take a second and take that all in. Sugar, 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 gold, silver. You really don't see a whole lot of tobacco. Sugar really is the dominant crop. So again, for those of you that are visual, hopefully this drives that point home. And now that this is recorded, you can go back and look at this longer when you want to and just, bask in the glory of 3 colors. Okay, let's talk about the slave trade real quick. This is worth spending a few minutes on. This is a depiction of what the interior of a slave ship would look like. Yes. So these are the most cramped bunk beds you've ever seen. These are essentially shelves. And you would slide your cargo, which is what the slaves are, into these narrow shelves. Because again, the purpose of the slave trade is to maximize profit. And to maximize profit, you pack as much cargo as you can onto the ship. You are not concerned with comfort. You are not concerned with luxury. You are not concerned with safety except to make sure that your cargo survives long enough to be sold. Question, James?
I was wondering, like, the answer is probably no, but do they at least separate the male and female slaves?
Sometimes, but not always. Separation isn't a huge problem because, and you probably can't see it, but there's a thin black line connecting all of them. They're chained together. And there really isn't a lot of opportunity to move around, as you can imagine. And again, this is not what the slave trade looked like prior to the Europeans showing up. Trans-Saharan slave trade, the East African slave trade, it didn't look like this. The Europeans turned it into something that is far more inhumane. And so I want you to take a moment and put yourself in this place, because this is one of the things that we don't often do. And it's one of the things that you have to do with history, is you have to try to empathize and internalize some of this. So let's paint you a quick little mental picture. All right, you've been taken from your home. You've been sold into slavery. You're placed on this ship. You don't know where you're going. You've probably never been at sea in your life. The largest body of water you've seen is a small lake or a river. So you're not entirely prepared for an ocean voyage anyway. And what's the typical motion of a vessel when it's sailing on the ocean? All right, you ride the crests of the waves, you sway a little bit, and what does that do to a lot of people? Seasickness. Picture that in those confines. It's dark, it's hot, you're in the tropics, there's no air conditioning. You're not going to have windows below decks where the cargo is kept, so it's stifling down there. Imagine the smell, unwashed bodies, vomit as people get sick. Do you see bathrooms? No. Well, they're going to let you up on deck for about 1 hour a day. So guess where you go to the bathroom? On yourself. Because you can't move. And again, go back to the motion of the ship. What is all this stuff doing? It's just sloshing around. Back and forth. Trickling down from the levels above.
You want to be on the highest, you don't want to be down at the bottom.
Shifting back and forth on the shelf that you're on. Dripping down over the edges. And again, don't make jokes. Take a moment and actually put yourself in this place. Try to envision just how dehumanizing this is. To know that you are a person and you're not being treated like a person. I mean, we don't even treat animals this way. You are being treated like cargo, and if the cargo gets a little wet, so what? Cargo gets a little banged up, not a big deal. You're laying on these rough timbers and you're being tossed back and forth, especially in a rough sea. Your skin's going to probably get scraped and bruised and scratched open. Your food, when you are fed, is not going to be good. Oatmeal, dried bread, salted meat. And they're not going to unchain you and let you sit up and give you a little tray and some utensils. They're going to slop it down next to your head, and you're going to turn your head and try to get what you can as everything else is sloshing around. That's your life for 6 to 12 weeks, depending on how long the voyage takes. And for that 1 hour a day, they're going to bring you up on deck. Give them a chance to clean out the cargo hold, try to get rid of some of the stench. And while you're up on deck, they're going to make you exercise, because if you just lie there for 6 weeks, your muscles would atrophy to the point where you wouldn't be able to walk when you got off the ship. Are you any good at a slave market at that point? Are they going to get any money for you? No. So they bring you up on deck, They bring up buckets of seawater from over the side and they douse you to clean you off and get most of the vomit and the smell and the urine and the feces off you. And how does that salt water feel on all those open cuts and scrapes? Imagine the sunlight in the middle of the day, in the middle of the ocean, in the tropics, after 23 hours of darkness. Blinded, disoriented, and now in a lot of pain because of all that salt water and all your open wounds. You feel feeble and weak because you're not eating much. You haven't been able to move your legs. They're stiff. And now the sailors take these small whips and they start beating at your feet to make you hop up and down so that your leg muscles get some work and don't atrophy quite as quickly. That's the experience on the Middle Passage. That's what the Europeans, first the Portuguese, then the Spanish, then the English, then the French, then the Dutch, that's what they turned the slave trade into. That's when it becomes all of those things that your stereotypes have turned it into. And like we told you before, all your stereotypes are valid. They're just a small part of the bigger picture. So when you get to the New World, that's what you do. You work in the farm fields, working on sugar, tobacco, cotton plantations, or mining. Some of the artist renderings from this time period try to make slavery look really nice. So here all your slaves are really well dressed. The men are in suits, the women are in dresses. Slavery looks pretty idyllic. Who wouldn't want to be a slave if you're treated that well? But that's not really what it's like. Here's where you're going to process the sugar. Imagine how hot it is in these places where you're purifying the sugar. No, this is once you're in the New World. This is how you process the sugar cane. Right, glorified hamster wheels. You run the sugar cane through these crushing stones. It crushes out the sugar and the juice. You discard the canes. Your job is to do this as quickly as possible for probably about 12 hours a day. Which means you need to keep these things moving. Which means you need to be paying attention to what you're doing, because if you're pushing through the canes and you go to grab the next deck and you lose track and your hand gets sucked into the crushing stones, sorry, dude. If your foot falls through the hole and you crack your ankle, you're not much use anymore, are you?
Why don't you feel solid?
Well, that would require more work and craftsmanship, and the idea here is to make a profit. Quicker and easier just to get another slave. This is the indoor production facility, same concept, less space. Plus, really warm, because you're inside. All right, so let's talk about what all this does. At the height of the slave trade, on these ships coming across the Atlantic Ocean, somewhere between 10 and 20% of all the slaves on the ship will die before they ever reach the colonies. Which means if you can put 200 on a ship, you're pretty much guaranteed that 20 will die of disease, infection, starvation, whatever. So you're already counting on a 10 to 20% loss of cargo before you even hit the New World. Now, if you were looking at them from the standpoint of people, you'd be like, wow, we got to change this. Like, if this was what commercial travel was like on airplanes, like, man, 20 people a flight are dying. We need to, like, they would fix that. Like, they'd put doors on the planes, you know, so people wouldn't get sucked out. But because this is cargo, this is just an acceptable loss. So you pack them in tighter, you get a few more in. That way, when we lose a couple more, it's not a big deal. Depending on the voyage, if the wind wasn't good, the ship went slower. If you had rough seas, if you had an outbreak of disease, you could lose half. Yes?
Wouldn't you want to take lots of them and treat them better to ensure that more will survive?
Good question. Wouldn't you want to take less of them and treat them better to ensure that more survive? Economically speaking, no. You would make less money if you took fewer and spent more on them, because you have the cost of the voyage. You have to pay the sailors. You have to pay for the food and supplies. You have to pay for the wear and tear on the ship. All of these become economic factors to take into consideration. So let's say you could drop your loss down to 5%, but you take 50 fewer slaves. You would end up losing money. And so again, that's one of the other things you need to keep in mind about this, is that this is really being done from an economic standpoint. This is not primarily fueled by hatred and racism and let's get as many black people as possible and hopefully kill a whole bunch. That was not the point. The point was to make as much money as possible from the acquisition and sale of cargo. Now, that's still pretty horrific that you're talking about human beings as cargo. But that's how they're justifying these trips, is we're trying to make money. So you pack them in tight, you know you're going to get a few that are damaged / die. And it's terrifying to think that you could be that callous of another human's life. That you could look at an entire boat full of people, know that 20 of them are going to die, and go, well, that's a good trip. Whether you want to call it karma or justice or whatever, the Europeans that went to Africa and stayed in those factories, those trading forts, acquiring slaves and then putting them on the ships, the mortality rate for Europeans in Africa was about 90%. 90% of the Europeans that went to Africa died. Any guesses from what? Malaria. So that's nowhere near justice, but it's worth noting. And then the last part to talk about is what finally makes all of this stop. After 200 plus years of the slave trade, the abolition movements, which first began in England and then spread to France and to Spain and to the colonies themselves, finally put enough pressure on the government to stop the slave trade from Africa. These European nations finally reach a point where society agrees that slavery is unethical and immoral. Now, your book talks about William Wilberforce. Most people know he's famous because he wrote a song that still is quite popular today. Anybody know what it is? Amazing Grace. He is more significant to history, though, because he was one of the leaders of the abolition movement in England. And so because of efforts from him and from people that agreed with him, England becomes one of the first countries to stop the slave trade, which then creates a domino effect amongst the other European nations. But after 200 plus years of the slave trade, you look at what happens to Africa. And some scientists and historians figure that had the slave trade never happened, at least the Atlantic one, Africa's population could have been doubled what it was, and without the significant gender disparity that you saw, where it became so heavily dominated by women. And so they then track that forward and they try to figure out what would Africa be like today had the Atlantic slave trade never happened. And it may very well have looked like a very different place. I mean, you look at the culture of warfare and conquest and violence that the gun slave cycle promotes. You look at the culture of, taking advantage of lower class people, especially from rival countries. You look at the rivalries that the slave trade creates between African nations. And it makes you wonder how much of that would be different today. Nick?
Wouldn't it also, if there were more people in Africa, wouldn't that also increase the competition for, in certain areas, limited resources such as water?
Assuming that everything else played out the way that it did, yes, you're right. A higher population could cause more problems as well. And so again, on some level, it's a little pointless to play what if, because there would be so many factors to consider. And Africa is able to recover from a population standpoint because of those new food crops that also help Europe. You know, corn and potatoes. But we're ultimately left with, we don't really know what it would be like. All we know is what it was like, which was, as a continent, fairly traumatized. You know, were there some places that were untouched by the slave trade? Yeah, there were. But were some of the most culturally developed, socially developed, affluent kingdoms some of the ones that were also the most affected? Yeah. And so again, it makes you wonder how Africa could have developed differently had those major kingdoms been allowed to expand their influence rather than competing with each other to sell each other as slaves. All right, quick questions on any of that? Emily? Yes, by that point, from what I've read, the trans-Saharan slave trade is pretty well cut off by that point. But again, back to a question that Nick asked earlier, what's going to happen not too long from now in Africa's history? The slave trade is going to stop in the 1750s through the 1780s. Quickly on the heels of that is going to be European colonization of Africa. They're going to use their Industrial Revolution technology, like trains and steamships, and be able to get into the interior of Africa and set up shop. And then once they discover the cure for malaria, Africa is wide open for settlement. And so they'll go from being exported to importing Europeans. And that's a whole nother chapter in Africa's story. Anything else? Other questions? All right.